There is a prison in Louisiana that sits on 18,000 acres of land, bordered on 3 sides by the Mississippi River and on the 4th by the Tunica Hills. To reach it, you drive through miles of flat, rural Louisiana landscape, past fields and tree lines, and the kind of geography that feels deliberately removed from the modern world, until the facility appears ahead of you, and you understand immediately that you have arrived somewhere that operates by its own logic, its own history, and its own rules that predate the correctional system that currently runs it. The Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola Prison. The land it sits on was once a plantation, not in the distant historical sense that applies to much of the American South, where plantation history exists as a layer beneath the present that requires excavation to fully see. At Angola, that history sits closer to the surface. The prison takes its name from the plantation that occupied this land before it, which itself took its name from the African country from which the enslaved people forced to work it were brought. The fields that those enslaved people worked are still fields today, and the people working them are still overwhelmingly black. And the compensation they receive for that work remains, by any measure that the outside world would recognize, almost nothing. This is not a coincidence of geography. It is a continuity of function that the American prison system has never been fully forced to reckon with publicly. Angola Prison is the largest maximum security prison in the United States. It covers more land than the island of Manhattan. It houses approximately 6,000 people at any given time, and approximately 85% of the people inside it will die within its walls. Not because of violence, though violence has shaped Angola's history in ways that are thoroughly documented, but because Angola holds one of the highest concentrations of people serving life sentences without parole of any correctional facility in the country. The people sent to Angola are not expected to leave. That reality shapes everything about the first 72 hours inside this facility. At most prisons, the first days are a period of orientation toward an eventual release, however distant. The structure of time inside a conventional sentence has direction. It moves towards something. At Angola, for most of the people receiving you into the housing unit and teaching you the unwritten rules of this specific environment, time does not move toward anything. It simply accumulates, day after day after day, on 18,000 acres of Louisiana farmland bordered by the Mississippi River, where the geography itself makes escape not just difficult, but functionally impossible. The first 72 hours at Angola introduce you to a place that operates unlike any other prison in the United States. Not because of its security level, though Angola is as secure as any facility in the American correctional system. Not because of its size, though the scale of this facility is genuinely unlike anything most people have encountered, but because of what it asks of the people inside it. Because of what it has always asked of the people on this land. Because of the particular weight that settles onto you when you arrive here and begin to understand that the history of this place and the present of this place are not as separate as the official language of the Louisiana Department of Corrections would suggest. This documentary takes you inside the first 72 hours at Angola Prison. Not the version that appears in the facility's official literature or the carefully managed access granted to journalists over the years. The documented, verified, psychologically grounded reality of what those first hours look like, feel like, and begin to do to a human being arriving at the largest maximum security prison in the United States. Built on land that has always extracted labor from the people confined to it. Operating today in ways that carry more of that history forward than most Americans are aware of or comfortable acknowledging. This is what the first 72 hours inside Angola actually looks like. And it begins the moment the transport vehicle turns onto the final road, and 18,000 acres of Louisiana flatland open up ahead of you with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide and nothing between you and the horizon, but the Mississippi River and the weight of everything this land is. The road that leads to Angola Prison is unlike the approach to any other correctional facility in the United States. Most prisons announce themselves gradually. You see the perimeter fencing from a distance. You see the watchtowers rising above the tree line. You see the razor wire catching light from half a mile away, and you understand what you are approaching before you arrive at it. The visual language of incarceration is familiar enough that the sight of a prison in the distance reads immediately for what it is. Angola does not work that way. The road to Angola takes you through 18,000 acres of Louisiana farmland before the facility itself becomes visible. You pass fields. You pass tree lines. You pass the kind of flat, rural Louisiana landscape that stretches toward the horizon with a flatness that feels almost geographic in its indifference to human presence. The Mississippi River is out there somewhere, running along the boundary of this land the way it has run along this boundary for longer than the prison has existed, longer than the plantation existed before it, carrying its water southward with complete indifference to what has always happened on the land beside it. The transport vehicle moves through this landscape, and the distance between you and the outside world becomes measurable not just in miles, but in something more fundamental. In the absence of exits. In the absence of other roads branching off in other directions. In the single purposeful geometry of a road that goes to one place and comes back from one place, and serves no other function in the geography of rural Louisiana than to connect Angola Prison to the rest of a world that feels, with every mile that passes, progressively further away. Then the facility appears, not as a distant silhouette growing larger as you approach, but as a presence that simply fills the landscape ahead of you all at once, because the scale of Angola is not something that resolves gradually from a distance. It is something that arrives. 18,000 acres of institutional land spreading in every direction. Fields visible beyond the perimeter. Housing units spread across the facility grounds with the spatial logic of something much larger than a prison, something closer to a small town built entirely around the function of containing human beings indefinitely within its boundaries. The transport vehicle passes through the first security checkpoint. Officers approach the vehicle with the practiced efficiency of people who have conducted this specific procedure many times. Documents are checked. The vehicle is verified. You are confirmed against a manifest that reduces your identity to a name, a number, and a destination within this facility. The checkpoint clears, and the vehicle moves forward into Angola, and the checkpoint closes behind you. You're inside now. Intake processing at Angola follows the procedural logic of every maximum security correctional facility in the American system. Your personal property is cataloged and removed. Your clothing is replaced with the institutional uniform of the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Faded, worn light blue fabric. The number stenciled directly onto the left chest in bold black print. Your number is 47821. And from this moment forward inside these 18,000 acres, that number is your primary identity in every interaction with the institutional system surrounding you. You're photographed, fingerprinted, medically screened, assessed for placement within the facility's housing structure. But intake at Angola carries something that intake at other facilities does not carry in quite the same way. It carries the weight of permanence. At most prisons, the intake process feels like the beginning of a sentence that will eventually end. The machinery of processing moves you from one status to another, but the direction of travel, however slow, points eventually toward a gate that will open in your direction. At Angola, for the majority of the people being processed around you, that direction does not exist. The intake process here is not the beginning of a journey toward release. For most people, it is simply the beginning. The correctional officer who completes your processing hands you a folder of facility information and speaks briefly about rules, expectations, and the structure of daily life within Angola's operational framework. The tone is professional, not unkind, but efficient in the way that people who work within institutions built around permanence develop an efficiency that has learned not to invest in the temporary. You are assigned to a housing unit, and as you're escorted from the intake area toward that assignment, you pass a window. Through it you can see the fields, flat and wide, and extending toward the tree line in the flat Louisiana light. And somewhere in the registered understanding of what those fields represent in the specific history of this specific land and the specific function those fields have served across more than a century of this facility's existence. Something settles onto you that has nothing to do with your sentence length or your security classification or any of the procedural facts that the intake process just established about your presence here. It has to do with where you are, not just geographically, historically, and that weight, once it settles, does not lift. The housing unit at Angola Prison is not what most people imagine when they think about maximum security incarceration. It is not a series of individual cells stacked in tiers with solid steel doors and small reinforced windows the way the popular imagination of prison tends to construct it. Angola's older housing units are dormitory style. Large open rooms containing rows of metal bunk beds arranged in lines across a wide institutional space. No individual cells. No private doors. No separation between you and the dozens of other people assigned to the same sleeping area beyond the narrow corridor of space between one bunk row and the next. You walk into this space, and the first thing you understand is that privacy, in any form that the outside world would recognize, does not exist here. Every movement is visible. Every conversation is audible. Every expression on your face is available to the observation of every other person in the room at all times. The institutional logic of dormitory housing is efficiency. More people managed in less physical space with less structural complexity than individual cell housing requires. But the human reality of dormitory housing in a maximum security prison is something that efficiency calculations do not capture. It is the specific vulnerability of existing without walls around you in an environment where the people sharing that open space are serving sentences measured in decades and lifetimes. You find your assigned bunk and you claim it. This is the first territorial act of your time at Angola, and it matters more than it might appear to. Your bunk is the only space within this entire facility that belongs to you in any meaningful sense. The thin mattress on the metal frame. The small storage locker beside it. These represent the complete physical boundaries of your private world inside 18,000 acres of institutional land. Everything beyond those boundaries is shared space governed by social rules that nobody wrote down and nobody will explain to you directly. You are expected to learn them by observation. The population of Angola's housing units is unlike the population of any other maximum security facility in the United States for one specific and defining reason. The majority of the people around you are never leaving. Not in the abstract sense that applies to people serving very long sentences who statistically may not survive to release, but in the legal and practical sense that their sentences carry no release date, no parole eligibility, no mechanism by which the institutional machinery will ever produce an exit in their direction. 85% of Angola's population is serving life without parole. Sit with that number for a moment. In a housing unit of 100 people, 85 of them woke up this morning knowing that they will wake up inside Angola tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day that follows for the remainder of their biological lives. They have organized their entire psychological existence around a reality that has no exit. They have developed relationships, routines, hierarchies, and a social world that functions not as a waiting room for something else, but as the permanent condition of their lives. This is the world you have just entered, and the people who inhabit it permanently can identify a new arrival within minutes of entering the housing unit. Not through any single obvious signal, but through the accumulation of small behavioral markers that distinguish someone who does not yet know how this specific world operates from someone who has lived inside it long enough to move through it without conscious thought. The way you hold your body, the direction of your eyes, the pace of your movement through the space, the specific quality of your awareness of the people around you. These things communicate your status in this environment as clearly as any verbal announcement. Long-term lifers at Angola have had years, and in many cases decades, to develop a reading of human behavior that the controlled social environment of maximum security incarceration produces in people who survive it successfully. They notice everything. They process it quickly. And within your first hour in the housing unit, they have formed an assessment of you that will shape every interaction that follows. The social structure of Angola's housing units reflects the specific psychology of a permanent population. At facilities where most inmates are serving finite sentences, the social hierarchies are partly organized around time. Who has been here longest? Who is closest to release? Who has the most institutional knowledge? And who is most vulnerable to the pressure that institutional knowledge can be used to apply? Time creates leverage in finite sentence environments because time is the resource everyone is managing. At Angola, time works differently. When everyone has all the time in the world and none of it is moving toward anything, the hierarchies organize around different resources. Reputation, institutional relationships built across years of proximity. The specific credibility that comes from having navigated this environment successfully across a very long period. The social world of Angola's housing units has been built slowly and carefully by people who understood from the beginning that this was the only world they were going to have. You're a visitor in that world, even though you are not visiting. The correctional officers who move through the housing unit carry their own relationship with the permanence of Angola's population. Officers who have worked this facility for years know many of the long-term inmates by name. Relationships develop across decades of daily proximity in ways that do not exist at facilities with higher inmate turnover. This familiarity does not compromise the institutional authority structure, but it creates a specific texture to the officer-inmate dynamic at Angola that differs from the more transactional relationships at facilities where populations move through more quickly. By the time the first evening count is conducted and the housing unit settles into the rhythms of its nighttime routine, you have been inside Angola for several hours. You have not yet seen the fields up close. You have not yet been assigned to a work detail. You have not yet experienced the specific daily routine that Angola's operational structure imposes on the people within it. But you have felt something that will stay with you across every hour of the first 72. The particular gravity of a place where the people around you stopped measuring time against an exit a very long time ago, and where you're only now beginning to understand what that means for the way time feels inside these 18,000 acres. The alarm does not wake you on your first full day at Angola. You are already awake. The dormitory housing unit does not produce the kind of sleep that the word rest implies. It produces something closer to a managed unconsciousness in which awareness never fully retreats because the environment never fully quiets. Sounds move through the open dormitory space without the buffering that walls and doors provide. The breathing and movement of dozens of other people. The institutional sounds of a facility that never fully stops operating regardless of the hour. The specific quality of Louisiana night air moving through ventilation systems designed for function rather than comfort. By the time the lights come on at full institutional brightness for the morning, count you have been lying awake for some time already. Watching the ceiling, listening to the facility around, you find its morning rhythm. Processing the accumulated weight of your first night inside 18,000 acres of Louisiana land from which there is no practical exit in any direction. Morning count in Angola is conducted with the same procedural precision as every count at every other correctional facility in the American system. All movement stops. All inmates stand or sit visibly at their assigned bunks. Officers move through the dormitory, confirming presence and accounting for every body in the space. The count must clear before anything else happens. When it clears, Angola begins its day. And Angola's day is organized around something that distinguishes it from every other maximum security prison in the United States. Work, not the optional programming or vocational training that other facilities offer as rehabilitative opportunity. Not the facility maintenance jobs that keep institutional infrastructure functioning, but mandatory agricultural field work on the 18,000 acres of Louisiana farmland that surrounds and contains the facility's housing units. Work that begins early in the morning Louisiana heat and continues through the day under the supervision of correctional officers on horseback stationed along the field rows to monitor the labor and ensure its continuation. You are assigned to a work detail. This assignment happens quickly. Angola's operational structure depends on the labor of its population in a way that few correctional facilities in the modern American system still openly acknowledge. The fields require workers. The institutional farm that Angola operates produces crops that feed the facility's population and generates revenue from agricultural operations. The system requires bodies in the field, and the bodies it has available are the bodies of the people serving sentences within its perimeter. The work assignment is not presented as optional. Angola operates under a trustee system and a tier of field labor assignments that reflects the facility's security classifications and institutional history. Newly arrived inmates are placed into the general labor pool, and the general labor pool goes to the fields. On your first full day at Angola, you walk out of the housing unit in the early morning Louisiana light, and you see the field for the first time from ground level. The experience is not what any description of it fully prepares you for. It is not the visual of the fields themselves, though the sight of flat agricultural land stretching toward the tree line in every direction with the Mississippi River somewhere beyond a southern boundary creates a geography of containment that is immediately and physically felt. It is something more specific than the visual. It is the accumulated meaning of standing on this particular land, in this particular uniform, with this particular number stenciled onto your chest, being directed toward these particular rows of crops by officers on horseback. The history of this land is not abstract when you're standing on it. Angola's plantation past is not a historical footnote that requires research to locate. It is present in the physical structure of the work itself, in the crops growing in rows that have been planted and harvested on this land for longer than the prison has existed, in the organizational logic of field labor supervised from horseback that connects the present operational reality of the Louisiana State Penitentiary to the operational reality of the Angola Plantation that preceded it on this same soil. The work is physical and it is sustained. Louisiana heat in the growing season is not a background condition. It is an active physical presence that shapes every hour of outdoor labor in ways that the body registers before the mind has fully processed. You are working in heat that the dormitory and the intake area and the transport vehicle did not prepare you for. You are working in a line of other inmates, each assigned to their row, moving through the crop at a pace that the supervision structure establishes and maintains. The compensation for this work is documented public record. It ranges from nothing to a few cents per hour, depending on assignment classification. For the work of planting, tending, and harvesting crops on 18,000 acres of Louisiana agricultural land, the people doing that work receive compensation that would not register as meaningful income in any economic context outside of a correctional facility. There is a word for labor extracted from a captive population for minimal compensation on land with a specific history. The Louisiana Department of Corrections does not use that word in its official documentation. But standing in the field on your first full day at Angola, with the sun moving across the Louisiana sky and the rows extending ahead of you and the officers on horseback maintaining the structure of the work, that word does not require official acknowledgement to make itself felt. It is present in the land itself, in the heat, in the rows, in the number on your chest, and the specific geography of containment that surrounds you in every direction. By the time the work detail returns to the housing area and the midday count is conducted and the afternoon schedule begins to unfold, you've spent your first hours doing the work that Angola has always asked of the people held within its boundaries. And something has shifted in your understanding of where you are. Not just a prison, a place with a specific relationship to labor and land and human bodies that the official language of modern corrections does not fully account for. And you've only been here for one full day. By the second day, inside Angola, something becomes visible that the first day was too overwhelming to fully process. The people around you have built a life here, not metaphorically, not in the resigned and diminished sense that the word life implies when applied to incarceration in the popular imagination, but genuinely, practically, and in some cases elaborately. The men who have been inside Angola for 10, 20, 30 years have constructed within the boundaries of this facility a social world that functions with a complexity and a depth that the outside world rarely associates with maximum security incarceration. They have done this because they had no alternative. When a sentence carries no exit, the psychological options available to a person narrow to two. You can spend every day of that sentence in a state of resistance to the reality of your situation, maintaining an orientation toward a future that the legal structure of your sentence has made structurally inaccessible, where you can build something within the reality you actually inhabit, something that gives the days meaning, something that makes the accumulated weight of years inside 18,000 acres of Louisiana land bearable enough to survive. The men who have survived Angola longest chose the second option. And what they build is unlike anything that exists inside any other maximum security prison in the United States. Angola has a full seminary program. The New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary operates a campus inside the facility through which inmates earn genuine theological degrees. Not correspondence courses, not abbreviated certificate programs. Full accredited seminary education that produces ordained ministers who conduct religious services for the facility's population. Angola has more inmate ordained ministers per capita than almost any comparable institution in the country. The religious culture inside this facility is not a performance of rehabilitation designed to impress parole boards that most of these men will never appear before. It is a genuine theological community built by people who needed something larger than their sentence to orient their existence around. You observe this during your second day. The chapel services that take place within Angola's schedule draw significant participation from the long-term population. The singing that comes from those services moves through the facility in a way that feels completely incongruous with the physical environment producing it. There is genuine musical depth in those voices. Genuine theological conviction in those words. A community of people who have found within the specific constraints of permanent incarceration a form of spiritual life that some of them describe as more authentic than anything they experienced in the outside world. This does not mean Angola is a good place. It means that human beings are extraordinarily resilient in the face of conditions that should, by any reasonable measure, extinguish the capacity for meaning entirely. Angola also has an annual rodeo. The Angola Prison Rodeo has operated since 1965 and is one of the most unusual events associated with any correctional facility in the United States. Once a year, the facility opens its gates to thousands of paying outside visitors who come to watch inmates compete in rodeo events inside a permanent stadium built within the prison grounds. The rodeo generates revenue. It generates publicity of a specific kind that the Louisiana Department of Corrections has historically found useful. And it generates something for the inmates who participate in it that is more complicated than either the revenue or the publicity. For one day a year, the outside world comes to Angola. For one day a year, the men inside this facility exist in the same physical space as people who will drive home afterward to lives that contain choices and futures and the ordinary freedoms that Angola's population has largely been permanently separated from. The rodeo is many things simultaneously. A fundraiser, a tourist attraction, a strange annual collision between the world inside these 18,000 acres and the world beyond the Mississippi River that normally never touches it directly. You are not here for the rodeo. You are here for 72 hours that will not include it. But the permanent infrastructure of the rodeo stadium is visible from parts of the facility grounds, and its existence tells you something about this place that intake processing and field work assignments and dormitory housing did not fully communicate. Angola has developed its own institutional culture across more than a century of operation. Not the temporary culture of a facility whose population turns over regularly as sentences end and new arrivals replace those released, but the deep, layered, historically accumulated culture of a place where the same people have been present for decades, building relationships and institutions and social structures on a timescale that no other correctional facility in the country can match. The men who have been here longest are not the broken remnants of people who entered younger. Some of them are, but many of them are something more complicated and more unexpected than that. There are people who found within the most constrained circumstances imaginable something that functions as a life, who built community in a place designed around permanent separation from the communities they came from, who created meaning in an environment that the sentencing structure declared permanently meaningless by removing every conventional marker of a future worth working toward. Watching them move through the facility on your second day, you begin to understand something about human resilience that no amount of outside observation could have taught you. It does not require freedom to survive. It requires purpose. And the men who have survived Angola longest found purpose in the only place available to them. Right here, on this land, within these boundaries, day after day after day, for as long as they have left. Somewhere in the space between hour 48 and the beginning of your third day, inside Angola, something happens to your relationship with time. It does not happen dramatically. There is no single moment you can identify afterward as the point at which the shift occurred. It happens the way that most significant psychological changes happen inside environments of sustained pressure, gradually and then suddenly, across a series of small accumulations that individually feel manageable and collectively produce something that the sum of their parts does not fully predict. You have been inside Angola for 2 days. And for the first time since you arrived, the immediate demands of navigation are quiet enough for something else to surface. The first 48 hours consumed everything available. Every unit of attention was directed outward. Reading the housing unit, learning the field work rhythm, observing the social structure of a permanent population, managing every interaction with the careful, deliberate precision that a new arrival in a maximum security environment must maintain to avoid the kind of early mistakes that follow a person through the entirety of their institutional life. That sustained outward focus consumed something that now, in its relative absence, reveals its cost. You're sitting on your bunk in the early evening of your second day. The dormitory around you is operating in its normal rhythm. The long-term residents are moving through routines so practiced that they require no conscious attention. Men who have been here for 15 and 20 years, settling into the specific evening patterns of life that has been lived inside these 18,000 acres long enough to feel, from the outside, almost ordinary. Nothing about this feels ordinary to you. And in the stillness of that observation, the full weight of where you are and what surrounds you arrives with a clarity that the busyness of the first 48 hours successfully prevented from fully forming. The Mississippi River is out there in the darkness beyond the southern boundary of this facility. You cannot see it from where you are sitting, but you know it is there in the way that a person always knows where the nearest exit is, not because they are planning to use it, but because the knowledge of its location is a form of psychological orientation that the human mind maintains automatically. Except that the Mississippi River is not an exit. It is a boundary, a natural barrier that the geography of this facility uses as effectively as any fence or wall the correctional system could construct. On 3 sides, the river curves around Angola's 18,000 acres like a geographic sentence, final and complete and indifferent to the human situation it contains. This is the moment when the isolation of Angola becomes physically felt rather than intellectually understood. Most prisons are isolated by their institutional design. Fences and walls and razor wire create the separation between inside and outside that the correctional function requires. At Angola, the isolation is deeper than institutional design because it is also geographic. The land itself participates in the containment. The river participates. The Tunica Hills on the remaining boundary participate. The single road that brought you here, running through miles of rural Louisiana landscape with no branches and no alternatives, participates. You are not just inside a prison. You are inside a geography that was selected precisely because it made departure without permission not just difficult, but for most practical purposes impossible. Communication with the outside world at Angola operates under the same constraints that apply at every maximum security facility. Phone calls are monitored, limited, and scheduled within the operational framework of a facility managing thousands of people's communication simultaneously. The connection to family and friends and the world beyond the river exists, but it exists at the facility's discretion and on the facility's terms. During your second evening, you make a phone call. The sound of a familiar voice arriving through the monitored institutional telephone line carries a weight that the 2 days of sustained alertness and managed composure have made almost unbearable to receive. Not because the voice says anything particularly significant, but because it comes from the other side of the river, from a world where people move through their evenings making ordinary choices about ordinary things without counting the hours until the next institutional count confirms their continued presence in an assigned location. The call ends. The line goes quiet, and you're back inside Angola. An older inmate who has been watching you from his bunk across the dormitory without appearing to watch you speaks briefly, not intrusively, not with the weight of a lesson being delivered, but with the specific economy of someone who has been inside this facility long enough to recognize exactly where you are in the psychological trajectory of a new arrival and who chooses, in this particular moment, to offer something that nobody offered him when he was where you are now. He says that the river gets easier to ignore. He says it takes about 6 months before you stop listening for it at night. He says this without sentimentality and without self-pity and without any apparent expectation of a response. He says it the way a person states a practical fact about an environment they have inhabited for so long that the facts of it no longer carry emotional weight in their delivery, even when they carry enormous emotional weight in their content. 6 months before you stop listening for the river at night. You lie back on your bunk, and the dormitory continues its evening rhythm around you, and somewhere beyond the southern boundary of 18,000 acres of Louisiana land, the Mississippi River moves southward in the darkness the way it has always moved. Indifferent, continuous, permanent in a way that makes even the longest sentence feel temporary by comparison. And that permanence, strangely, is the first thing inside Angola that is felt in any way like comfort. 72 hours after you arrived at Angola Prison, you are standing in the morning light before the third day's first count, and something has changed that you cannot fully articulate, but can completely feel. It is not a dramatic transformation. Nothing about the psychological shifts that occur inside correctional environments of this weight, and history announces itself with clarity. What has changed is something more fundamental than behavior or attitude or the surface presentation of a person adapting to a difficult environment. What has changed is something in the way you understand where you are, not just geographically, not just institutionally, but historically, in the full accumulated weight of what this specific land has always been and what it continues to be, and the relationship between those two things that the official language of Louisiana corrections has never been required to fully address publicly. You have worked the fields. You have slept in an open dormitory surrounded by men who will never leave this place. You have heard the river in the darkness beyond the southern boundary and understood through the body rather than through the mind what it means to be contained by geography as completely as by any wall or fence the correctional system could construct. And you have watched the men who have been here longest move through their days with a practiced adaptation that took years to build, and that represents something extraordinary about human resilience, even as it represents something deeply troubling about what made that resilience necessary. Angola Prison houses approximately 6,000 people. 85% of them will die here. That number, which you first encountered as a statistic before you arrived, has a different weight after 72 hours inside the facility it describes. It is no longer a data point. It is the faces in the dormitory. The hands in the field rows beside yours. The voice of the older inmate who told you, without sentimentality, that it takes 6 months before you stop listening for the river at night. It is the seminary students carrying theological texts across the facility grounds toward an education that will produce ministers who will never serve a congregation outside these 18,000 acres. It is the rodeo stadium sitting permanent and weathered inside the perimeter, waiting for the one day a year when the outside world comes through the gates to watch before driving home again. 6,000 people, 85% of them permanent, on land that has been extracting labor from the people held within its boundaries since before the correctional system that currently administers it existed. The Louisiana Department of Corrections describes Angola's mission in the language of modern corrections: public safety, rehabilitation, institutional management. The official documentation of this facility uses the same vocabulary that correctional systems across the country use to describe the function and purpose of incarceration. But the fields exist, and the history of those fields exists, and the people working those fields exist, and the compensation those people receive for working those fields exists as documented public record that the vocabulary of modern corrections does not adequately account for, no matter how carefully that vocabulary is constructed. Angola is not an aberration within the American prison system. It is an extreme expression of tendencies that exist throughout it. The use of incarcerated labor at minimal or no compensation. The concentration of black men within facilities operating on land with specific racial histories. The permanent removal of people from their communities through sentences that carry no mechanism of return. The gap between the official language of correctional purpose and the documented reality of correctional practice. These things are not unique to Angola. Angola simply makes them visible in a way that is harder to look away from in most. After 72 hours inside this facility, you understand something about the American justice system that the statistics and the policy documents and the official reports communicate in a flattened and abstract form that the lived experience of 3 days on this land communicates with an immediacy and a weight that no document can replicate. Justice is not a single thing. It is a practice, an ongoing set of decisions made by institutions and individuals about what people deserve, what communities require, and what the past owes the present and the present owes the future. And when those decisions accumulate across generations on a specific piece of land with a specific history, the result is not just a prison. It is a place like Angola, where the river runs along the boundary and the fields stretch toward the tree line, and 6,000 people wake up every morning inside a world that the outside world built and continues to fund and largely prefers not to examine too closely. You have examined it. For 72 hours you have been inside it. And what those hours cost in understanding is something you carry out of this documentary and into every subsequent conversation you have about what justice in America actually looks like when you get close enough to see it clearly. TruthDoc&Story exists to get that close. Every week we go inside the facilities, the histories, the systems, and the human realities that the official version of the American prison story leaves outside the frame. The next episode of 72 Hours is already being built, and it will take you somewhere that will change what you think you know about incarceration in America just as completely as these 72 hours at Angola have. Subscribe. Hit the notification bell, because these are the stories that matter, and you deserve to hear every one of them.